In total, according to official history, 5 winter palaces were created in St. Petersburg. At the beginning of the 18th century, the wedding chambers of Peter I were built in 1716, followed by the Tsar instructing the architect George Murtanovi to build a new winter palace. 4 years later, Peter I and his entire family moved to this new palace. In 1731, Empress Anna Leonova ordered the refurbishment of the Petrovsky Palace, where the construction was carried out by the architect Rastrelli. The Empress moved into the new building for permanent residence 4 years later. The building consisted of 4 stories which housed about 70 ceremonial halls, more than 100 bedrooms, a gallery, and its own theatre. However, after the death of the Empress, the throne was occupied by Yelizaveta Petrovna. On the 1st of January 1752, Yelizaveta decided to expand the Winter Palace, after which the neighbouring plots of the Raguzinsky and Yagozinsky were bought. At the new location, Rastrelli built new buildings. For the 4th time, a temporary winter palace was built in 1755 at the corner of Nevsky Prospect and the embankment of the Moika River. It was dismantled in 1762. Finally, we turn to the 5th winter palace that came to our time. Here begins the most interesting project of this palace. The architect Rastrelli was again commissioned, who had already rebuilt the wedding chambers and former winter palaces, having experience in erecting other buildings in St. Petersburg. From 1754 to 1762, the now existing Winter Palace was built, which at that time became the tallest residential building in St. Petersburg. The building contained about 1,500 rooms. The total area of the palace was about 60,000 square meters. And that now covers all of the official history on the construction of the Winter Palace. So let's turn to the actual history. Imagine that we have a building contractor in the person of Empress Yelizaveta Petrovna and a performer like the architect Rastrelli. These two have been living in St. Petersburg for a long time, and this is a very important point. Because if they have been living in this area for a long time, it means they are well aware of the peculiarities of the climate of this city. Now, this illustrious architect has built a magnificent palace with huge halls accompanied with magnificent facades. Most importantly, a basement that has large windows. Here's the question: why would someone familiar with flooding in St. Petersburg design a basement of such appearance? After all, no normal builder would create windows in a basement with such frequent flooding. The architect should have simply discarded his basement plans. Now, let's see if Empress Yelizaveta Petrovna might not have known about the flooding when she approved the basement under the palace. However, she couldn't help but know about it. After all, Peter I caught a bad cold and died barefoot during his heroic deed trying to save wandering fishermen during the floods of 1724. After the flood of 1729, Peter II moved the capital to Moscow. Only 3 years later, the status of the capital was returned to St. Petersburg by Tsaritsa Anna Leonovna. Yelizaveta Petrovna never experienced severe floods, but regular floods and flooding have brought a lot of trouble. So, the Empress ordered the foundations to be built a foot above the flowing water. From history, we see that Yelizaveta knew about the floods. During her reign, the houses were often flooded. Why then did she agree to the windowed basements in the new Winter Palace? It seems to me that this doesn't quite make sense, but it could be explained quite simply. And that's that this Winter Palace stood before Peter I and is an actual ancient building. It has always stood in its place, and its basement is backfilled with clay, the first floor of an ancient building. There were no previous Winter Palaces, only the existing Winter Palace. This is a real ancient antediluvian building, which has been redesigned in the 19th century for modern needs. There is further evidence that the Winter Palace went to the new residence of St. Petersburg almost finished. This is the mezzanine. Now, let's see the meaning of the word mezzanine or mezzanine floor. Mezzanine floor. It's a relatively lightweight structure that is arranged between floors in rooms with high ceilings. Here's how the mezzanine described in Igor Zimmer's book. Winter Palace, People and Walls. History of the Imperial Residence. The mezzanine of the palace is an amazing and controversial phenomenon during the initial architectural study of the interiors of the Winter Palace. There was no mention of any mezzanines. However, as soon as the palace was about to be delivered to its own proprietor in the afternoon, with iron predestination, they began to erect mezzanines. They quickly got used to the mezzanines. Without them, the palace premises were already unimaginable. The mezzanine not only filled the entire first floor of the Winter Palace, but also extended to the second front floor of the palace. Look at this photo. This is how the bathroom of Nicholas I, located on the mezzanine of the Winter Palace, looked like. These are the closets that divided the huge hall of the Winter Palace. Let's get back to the history of Trinity 5th version of the Winter Palace, the proprietor of which was Empress Yelizaveta Petrovna, who knew how she wanted her future palace with the help of a well-known architect of extensive experience in St. Petersburg. However, in the end, the palace turned out to have large basements which were periodically flooded with water. The architect designed huge and beautiful halls. These luxurious premises were built almost immediately with small rooms, wooden partitions and floors. Almost the entire architect's plan was ruined by the small closets. This is completely illogical. After all, it was an all-new building. All of this can be explained by the fact that there were no intermediate buildings. There were no former winter palaces. The 5th version of the Winter Palace has long stood on this site. We can see the palace even now. The entire history of St. Petersburg has already been invented. The city was already built when people started to settle there again. It was the beginning of the 19th century. So, around 1840, people began to inhabit the vacant buildings. The Winter Palace was already standing in its place with huge halls and flooded basements. This building wasn't suitable for life with the changing climate. Such a huge building couldn't be heated. Therefore, these rooms were divided into small closets with wooden partitions. Small closets can be heated with an ordinary stove, but the huge halls of the Winter Palace were designed for a warm climate. The modern interior decoration of the Winter Palace was acquired at the beginning of the 20th century. We are told that royalty actually lived in these halls. In fact, such elegant halls have only recently begun to look like this. Look at these photos from 1926. What we see in the building where the Tsars have been living for 100 years, mutilated by the mezzanine of an ancient gallery. Look, this is 1926. We don't know how the Winter Palace actually looked like at the end of the 19th century. I tend to think that with such small mezzanine rooms, the entire Winter Palace was actually filled. This was practical, since such premises are easy to heat in winter. In short, Rastrelli didn't build the Winter Palace. This building has been standing since ancient times. St. Petersburg began to be settled at the beginning of the 19th century. In order to live in the Winter Palace, people had to divide its huge halls into small closets to keep warm. The problem of heating the Winter Palace was solved only in the 20th century. Once the issue of heating the Winter Palace was resolved, it transformed into the splendor we see now. These halls have nothing to do with actual history.